Let's talk about the problems that the police face and all the different types of problems that come along with it. It's obviously not an easy job, as we already talked about. It's dangerous. Uh, they're subject to isolation. Sometimes they're on their own in the job, and then dealing with their own individuals, stressors. But their role, as we talked about in using discretion, their role is ambiguous, right? How should they perform? Should they use discretion more? Should they use it less? What are my peers doing? Am I doing a good job? What does the community think? So there's a whole number of things that give rise to problems in policing. And we're going to talk about burnout, stress. They take it home, right? This job is 24/7. You might be reporting at 7 a.m. and done at 7 p.m. or starting at 7 p.m. and done at 7 a.m. Yes, some of these folks do 12-hour shifts, but they take it home. It's a 24-hour job. It's always on your mind. It's dangerous. They put the public's needs over their own safety. When they do take these jobs home, there's a rise in domestic issues. There's a rise in alcoholism. There's a rise in depression. So outside of these being dangerous and putting the public needs over their own safety, a lot of them are poorly trained. The pay could be inadequate. Equipment issues, it's either lacking, the police cars are old, there's a lack of technology, or it's subpar. Let's take bulletproof vests. I'll give you an example because this was surprisingly brought to my attention in speaking with friends of mine who are in the law enforcement business, that the bulletproof vests one of them was wearing, they come with expiration dates, and they were wearing 2-year-old bulletproof vests. They were outdated by 2 years. And the question, becomes, you hope that it does what it's supposed to do in the event that you're faced with being shot at and having to use it. And I was pretty surprised to hear that information. But substandard equipment, lack of support, lack of training. They also believe that the court system favors, this causes some of their stress, the court system favors criminals. They believe that criminals are more favored by the courts and the prosecution. They get a break. Some of that belief. So how do they fight stress? How's it combating stress? Support from their comrades, their partners, their colleagues in the department. They also have nowadays they've implemented wellness programs that involve support for family members and themselves, and I don't want to use the term therapy, but wellness programs, exercise, meditation, nutrition. More discussion with regards to understanding the specific positions, bringing folks in to talk to their their family members so they can support the law enforcement person, so they get an idea of what they face day to day. So those things are helping to combat with the stress, or put in place to help combat stress, because it is an extremely stressful position. Another problem with police is fatigue. As I told you what their shifts were, and it's not just once or twice. They work long shifts, day in and day out, sometimes a lot of overtime. When we had the prison break here in Dannemora, Clinton County, everybody in law enforcement was working nonstop. When there's short when they're short staff of officers who are out or they've gone through some budget cuts, they work longer shifts. They get tired. How do you feel when you're tired? Are you on your A game? No. What happens when a police officer isn't on their A game? Problems can occur. Think of a truck driver who's driving and fall asleep, right? How about a surgeon? Things happen. They can, crash their vehicles. They can respond inappropriately in a situation. They can hurt someone. Can this ever be resolved? Can this be fixed? Fatigue? Maybe requiring rest periods, or controlling overtime in these longer shifts, maybe work shorter shifts, maybe limits on overtime. But sometimes overtime is the result of an emergency situation, like the prison break. Another policing problem, violence. Some cops engage in the conduct, aggressive, and they can take it out on those less vulnerable. It is usually the same individuals who get the complaints, and they're usually the younger and lesser experienced law enforcement agents that engage in violence and brutality, and basically, let's just call it aggressive tactics. And we're going to talk more about the use of deadly force and excessive force shortly in the next topic. But many departments are employing specialized training to kind of curb this conduct. Sometimes, though, I'm going to point out, if it continues, I mean, it's a small percentage of officers who are involved with this kind of conduct, but sometimes it allows for folks who were the victims of police violence to sue the agency and the municipality that's responsible for them. So if it's the New York State Trooper, it'd be the New York State. It's a city, Plattsburgh police officer, the city of Plattsburgh, where courts allow for civil judgments to be had against those municipalities, especially when supervisors are ignoring the conduct or allowing the conduct to happen. But overall, you should be aware that law enforcement has the veil of immunity, where when they engage in certain conduct, they would be immune from a civil lawsuit, depending on a determination of whether their conduct was reasonable under the circumstances. And I'm being very general when I say that, but they have a blanket of immunity. So do prosecutors, and so do judges. That shields them from civil liability. And it's a hard threshold to beat, but it does happen when there's overstepping of the bounds and their conduct is unreasonable and the conduct is being condoned by supervisors. Other problems, corruption, and this has been around, as we talked way back from the earlier chapters, this has been around since the creation of policing, where cops ignore violations of a law, or they even join criminals or had relationships with them. They accept gifts if they turn an eye on a crime being committed. And we know from watching many movies that, what that looks like, where, it might be, a drug ring paying off the cops to turn away and not see it happen. But the number is really few. It's not a common thing. It's a few bad apples, as they say. But it does put a blemish, though, on, even if it's one person. It puts a blemish on the entire profession. It makes it look as though it happens all the time. Types of corruption could be threats of legal action. How about a female drug user is caught with cocaine, right? and the police officer says, well, if you have sex with me, I won't arrest you. That is a form of corruption. Demanding bribes, right? Misuse of power for personal gains, payoffs. Those are just a few examples. What causes corruption? What causes corruption? Lack of means to live the lifestyle they wish. They have a cynical attitude. It's easy to get what they want, right? They can, if they keep a low profile, not much supervision when they go out and about. These are all causes. Can corruption be controlled? What's the strength of the review process of officers and departments? Maybe that's what has to happen. You have to strengthen those review processes. More hands in internal affairs departments. That's the group that reviews police conduct. We talked about that. Making supervisors accountable for conduct of the officers under them. So the supervisors would get in trouble right along with them, even if they weren't really a part of it, because it's their job to supervise them. Have outside review boards review and investigate corruption, or special prosecutors. Special prosecutors would be an outside prosecutor from the normal county prosecutor of criminal cases. The reason being is because a prosecutor who prosecutes the law enforcement agents' cases, they have to have a working relationship, and there might be some ethical lines, or some personal. You have to work with them, so there might be some personal relationships there. So a special prosecutor, someone who doesn't have those contacts, would come in and investigate corruption. As a matter of fact, one of the laws that was passed in New York recently, in the last couple months, relative to police actions, was that the Attorney General would handle not necessarily corruption, but could handle corruption, but in the use of force type cases that we're going to get to in a second, the governor made it the position of the Attorney General to investigate any police conduct involving a death of a civilian. So a special prosecutor can be also appointed to investigate reports of corruption. Okay? Is any one method better than the other? Any one of these? Or should there be a combination to control corruption? Corruption is very few. Is it? It's not a big, widespread issue or problem in policing. So having any one of these in play, or all of them in play, would reduce it even further than it already is. It's for you to figure out. Let's talk about use of force. This is at the forefront of one of the police problems that we're facing in this country. We see it time and time again. By who? Who feeds it to us? The media, right? But in reality, the use of force is not very common. Think of this like when we address the crime rate and the focus that the media puts on the crime rate, right? It makes it look like our country's out of control, but the crime rate has been decreasing ever since 1991. Think of this the same way. I'm not saying don't overlook it by any means, because it's always been a question what constitutes the use of force, and when can law enforcement use deadly force. but try and take it out of the what you see on social media and the media and be objective. The use of force is not very common. 17% of U.S. residents that are 16 or older had face-to-face contact with police. 9 out of 10 who had contact with police felt that the officers acted properly. In 1.4% of all stops, the officer either used or threatened to use force. And African Americans and Hispanics were 2 to 3 times more likely than whites to be searched during traffic stops. We've talked about that. Traffic stops and searches. We're going to be turning to this procedure. That's our next topic when we talk about the procedure. But let's stick with use of force. So how much force is being used by the police today? Not very common. But the media attention puts it at the forefront, and it should very well be, because we have this fine line. So when do we have deadly force, and when is there non-deadly force, and is there some happy medium? In New York, the governor did away with deadly force. Can't use deadly force unless the civilian who they use deadly force on had a weapon and was going to use force. So very much eliminated it. In other areas, even though it was very restrictive to begin with. So let's go over where it is. So when can law enforcement use force to make an arrest? The enforcement and the use of deadly force is governed by the U.S. Constitution. Okay? And my slide has kind of outlined where this deadly force has come in. You can only use deadly force if the individual, it's like the force is likely to cause death or, well, back up 1 second. Deadly force is defined as force that is likely to cause death or bodily harm versus use of force. Taser for some reason. It's not deadly, but it's certainly a way of using force. We'll talk about it in a minute. Deadly force is force that is likely to cause death or bodily harm. We've also seen instances where an individual, they call it suicide by cop, where they don't listen to the law enforcement agents' command, and in their own safety, they take action. The controlling case by the Supreme Court is Tennessee versus Gardner. And in this, the court said that our search and seizure law under the Fourth Amendment, meaning you can't search and seize property without probable cause, applies here with regards to use of deadly force, because deadly force is a form of seizure. The use of deadly force must be scrutinized under constitutional reasonableness. So we're looking at what was reasonable. The only constitutional reasonable circumstances under which law enforcement can use deadly force to arrest or apprehend a fleeing felon. So when they're conducting an arrest or apprehending a fleeing felon is when law enforcement has probable cause. They need that fancy term, probable cause, to believe that the suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or others. So it's a very fine line where they have probable cause, meaning they have evidence to believe that the suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious injury to the officer or others. That's it. Cannot use this deadly force if the individual is committing some low-level misdemeanor theft, like taking food from the grocery store and they're running from the grocery store with it. You cannot shoot a fleeing felon, okay? And you certainly can't shoot a fleeing felon unless there's going to be serious death or serious physical injury to an officer or another. And we've all seen, and let me, before I move on, if law enforcement exceeds this, they can be subject to criminal prosecution. And we've seen it in public cases, leaving it to a jury to decide whether their conduct was reasonable. Or civil action, as I just discussed. Yes, they have this immunity component, but did it exceed reasonableness? So if somebody is fleeing from the cops are saying, stop, I'll shoot. Yeah, they can't really, depends on the circumstances, right? We just talked about. And finally catches up to you, is within, a few feet of you, or I won't say you, I'll say suspect, catches up to the suspect, and the suspect reaches towards their waistband and then turns towards the police officer with whatever is in their hand, and the police officer shoots and ends up killing the suspect. Was that reasonable under circumstances? And come to find out, it's not a gun but a cell phone they took out of their pocket. If you're looking at the circumstances that the police is chasing somebody and they're running from the police and they're reaching into near their waistband where a gun could be kept or some other weapon, and then turns towards the police officer, what's reasonable under the circumstances? But unlike the case in South Carolina, there is a video. I will try and find it and put it up. I'm pretty sure I can get my hands on it. It will be very, what's the word I'm looking for? I'll put a warning label on it. It's very, you could see everything that goes down on the video. It happened out of South Carolina, where the police officers had called the cops. Where the police officer pulled this individual over who was driving their vehicle. There was a brake light out. The person got out of the car and ran. It was an African American man, and was running through the park, and the one cop opened fire on him. You could see the whole thing. Somebody videotaped it. It was caught on video. And you see them doing nothing to help the individual. They go over and handcuff him, even though he's laying face down. He's just been shot in the back. And in that case, the officer was removed from the police force, was charged with murder, and he was sentenced to prison. That is, how things play out. What happened, recently in the last 6 months, Mr. Floyd in Minnesota, and the video of the cop kneeling on his neck, and he died as a result. And those 4 cops have been charged. Now they have to face a jury. Let me give you this example. The neighbors call the cops about a dispute happening next door. The cops arrive. It's a gated fence. They can't get in. It's a gated fence. It's locked. They see a man chasing a woman in the front yard, and they can see that she's bleeding, and they can see that he's holding a knife as he's running after her. The gate's locked. The cop sees the man push the woman down, and the man is standing over her. The cop yells, "Drop the knife!" The police, and they don't, and he lifts up his knife as he's gonna, stab the woman, and the cop shoots and kills him. Reasonable deadly force? Right? That's the situation where we would want the police to use deadly force, cause serious harm or injury to another. Can they use non-deadly force? Is there a better way? Non-deadly force? It's unlikely to cause death or serious harm. What about using rubber bullets? A stun gun, taser, restraints. How about fists? Can they be used versus using deadly force? Can a taser be like overused too? Can they overstep their boundaries using one of these? Sure. I've actually seen it happen on a video here in Plattsburgh where an individual was in a altercation with somebody else outside a bar here in the city, and the police came and broke it up. My client was a little intoxicated, so they had to kind of restrain him, and they do. They take him down reasonably at this point due to the behavior in the video. It's reasonable. They take him down, they handcuff him. So now he's laying face down on the sidewalk and his arms are behind his back and he's handcuffed, and one cop takes out a taser and tases him. Like, at that point, it's excessive and overused, and certainly actions were taken. So yeah, they can step over their bounds. No, they're not going to kill him with a taser, but was that reasonable? No. So our test here is, what would a reasonable officer do in the situation? Right? Let me give you an example. I know I've given you a few. I'm going to give you one more. An officer is approached in a threatening manner by someone wielding a knife. The officer says, "Stop," and drop the knife, and the person doesn't. They continue to approach the officer, who then shoots and kills the person. What if we find out that the person was deaf and couldn't hear the command? Would the officer be liable? Was it reasonable? The question is objectively reasonable. What would a reasonable person? He didn't know that the individual was disabled. What if he did? What if he knew? What if he had been dealing with this person before? Then it might not be reasonable. So, use of force is certainly going through some reform right now. Countrywide. New York has taken action, as I've already had mentioned. So this is something that is a problem in policing, and something that's at the forefront of what we're dealing with in this country. So we're going to see some more reform in this area. Our next and last topic will be discussions regarding police searches and seizures and interrogations.